Hello, here we're going to introduce you to ArcPy and tool messaging. So you're familiar with this because you're familiar already with the ArcGIS tool messages that happen when you run a tool. That window that most of the time when you're learning we tell you don't ever click the button that automatically closes the messaging window from a tool, because that's where you can get messages that tell you about how the tool was run, whether or not there are any warnings or any error messages. More often than not, you get just this one message at the bottom that tells you when it started and when it succeeded and how long it took for the tool to run. But every time, regardless if you see this window or not, every time a tool runs in ArcGIS, whether or not you're running from the desktop in ArcMap or ArcPro, or you're running it from ArcPy, all of these things are captured in the tool messages. So the things that get captured are the start and stop times, the parameters that were used. So you notice here that it's from the same thing that you filled out in the tool. And when we run this from ArcPy, it's from what you have filled out in the syntax, the progress of the script and tool, and any warnings or any error messages. So there are three types of messages that we can gain access to with ArcPy. And we can gain access to them with the get messages, get message count, and get message tools. And these are methods that we can use for our scripts. So each of these can be used to view the geoprocessing tool messages that you're familiar with seeing from your desktop environment. The first one we're going to talk about is get messages. This is the one that you'll use the most often. This is what is going to return a message from the most recent geoprocessing tool. That severity, that right there, that optional severity that you can put in to your script. So just know that all of the messages that get reported every time a tool is run, they are categorized by severity. A 0 which is the default if you do not put anything in here for this optional parameter. It means that all messages are returned. So everything, you'll see the start and stop time, the parameters, the warnings in the messages. If you put a 1 in here, you'll only see a message if there was a warning thrown when the tool was running. And if you put in a 2, you'll only see a message that dictates that there was an error returned. So if you put in 2 and everything runs cleanly, you won't see any messages reported by the get messages tool. So that's fine, but what I like to show you is how this is actually used within a script. So at this point, it's probably worthwhile to talk through everything that's happening in this script. So at the top, it's the import ArcPy, right? In order to gain access to our geoprocessing tools, we have to import the ArcPy module. Then next thing I've done is I've set my workspace environment to be a folder called My Data. So I'm assuming that I have some data living in there, and whatever tools I run, I would like to save into this workspace. And notice that since the workspace is just a folder name, this tells me that the data I'm going to be accessing are shapefiles, right? If this workspace were a file geodatabase, if it had a .gdb extension on it, that would mean that I was going to be working with file geodatabase feature classes. I would be using feature classes and saving feature classes. But since it's just a folder, I'm dealing with shapefiles. Notice that I've turned on my overwrite output environment, set it to be true. That way, as I'm writing this script, I can run it over and over again without having to worry about changing my output data set names, right? So then I don't have to worry about going and putting a 1, a 2, a 3 at the end of it in order to test my script. All right, now the next thing here is my try except block. So I've put everything that's going to really be doing any geoprocessing inside of a try except block. That way, if an error does get caused in the main portion of my script, it will go to the except, and then it will just cleanly exit. It'll print error and script, and I know that something went wrong within my try block, but it allows for the script to end cleanly and not have any processes kind of lingering in the background. So here you can see that I've set up some variables to hold different data set names and also something called buff dist. So really what I should tell you ahead of time is that the purpose of this is to buffer parks, which is my parks.shape, by 500 feet. And here in my comment, I've told myself that I'm using variables as my inputs and outputs. So I've called my buffer tool, arcpy.buffer_analysis. Remember, this could be analysis.buffer. So I know that for the buffer tool, it needs an input feature class. That's my buff in FC. It needs an output feature class. a parks buffer. That's the data set that will be created. And then I know that the next variable is the distance. So buff dist here. I will say the one thing I am missing in this little snippet here is that I should have a comment here that gives myself the syntax of this tool from help. That way I know all of the required and optional parameters that are necessary for buffer. And you'll learn to do that. Here, after this tool, notice I've put in the ArcPy.getMessages. Now, the best way to do this is that you put it in with a print statement, because the only way you're going to see the messages that get reported back is if you print them out to yourself. So I have this here, print, and then the parentheses required for print. ArcPy.getMessages, and notice I just have the open and close parentheses there. I've left it blank. Remember, that's because this in here, the severity is optional. But I've already told you, and the way I knew it was that I read from the help documentation that the default is a 0, meaning all messages will be returned. So here I'm going to print this, and after it runs the buffer analysis, it's just going to print out all the messages from the buffer tool. At the end of my script, I'm turning off my overwrite output. That's just to keep the rest of your data safe. It's always a best practice to turn that off. And then that's the end of my try block, and then here, except if anything were to go wrong in here, I would get that error message right there. Now the key that I want to talk about here is that this ArcPy.getMessages only works for the most recent geoprocessing tool that has been used. So if I had other tools above this tool, say a select and a clip, and I put my get messages here after buffer just once, it would not report out to me my select messages or my clip messages. It's only going to report out the messages from the most recent geoprocessing tool. And for this script right here, it is the buffer tool. All right, so let's talk about get message count and get message. Get message count returns a count of all the messages from the most recent geoprocessing tool. So we've talked about that get messages. It's a whole, and I'll go back and I'll show you. So get these messages involve all of these pieces of information, okay? And all of these are going to have an index number within the messages. And get message count and get message are a way if you want to isolate certain messages. So get message inside of here returns a specific message based upon an index position. So like I mentioned, these can be used together to isolate and report back specific tool messages. So you can see I've given you the syntax for each of these. Get message count, it doesn't have nothing required, no optional parameters. But get message does have a required parameter of index, and that's the index position of the message that you want to get. So in our little code example here that I pulled from the Esri help, so this is the purpose of this is to print the first and last message returned by the last tool executed. So what it's doing here is it's populating a variable called message count. It's calling ArcPy.getMessageCount to count the number of messages that were reported back. It's going to print out ArcPy.getMessage0. Remember, that's going to be the message sitting at index level 0, which means the first message that was in the ArcPy.getMessages, which we didn't have to call, but we can gain access to the information that would have been within it by calling the index value. Then we're going to, down here, we're going to print message again. We're going to take this message count, so it's going to have the total number of messages that were found within get message count. It's going to take away 1. All right, so whatever we went up to, it's going to take away 1. So that's going to print out to you the very last message that was in the list of messages available. This methodology is not used all that often, but usually textbooks and a lot of help documentation will refer back to get message count and get message. So I like to show you their syntax and give you an example about how they can be used. But really the tool that we are going to be using in this class is the ArcPy.getMessages, printing out our geoprocessing messages, because this is going to be the way that we're going to be able to evaluate whether or not our tools run the way that we expect. And it's a way to give the user, while they're watching your script run, some feedback, some information, so they're not just watching a blank screen and then watching your script end, and they don't really see anything reported back to them. It's a way to have the tools report back to the user that they have successfully been run. So that was your introduction to the messages that can be captured and printed out in ArcPy, and you'll see later on in the semester how we'll use this information to help us in our error detection and debugging of our scripts.